A new political wave is sweeping across Southern Africa. The influence of liberation parties that delivered independence appears to be fading. Earlier in the year, the ANC lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since independence in 1994. In Botswana, voters rejected the Botswana Democratic Party, which had been in power since independence in 1966, and replaced it with the Umbrella for Democratic Change. Younger voters have largely led this growing movement for change. So this week on the program, we examine why liberation movement parties in Southern Africa are struggling and ask, what exactly has changed? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. While the call is clear in Southern Africa, younger voters want change. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Robert Nagila takes a closer look at some of the recent elections in Southern Africa.
It's been a rough year for liberation-era ruling parties in Southern Africa. In May, South Africa's long-time ruling African National Congress lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since the end of apartheid in 1994. And in early November, the ruling Botswana Democratic Party was trounced in elections after almost 6 decades in power. It must be said, both parties accepted the outcomes graciously.
I will respectfully step aside.
An upset to the trend came in Mozambique, perhaps, where election results showed the long-time ruling Frelimo party not only held on to power, but did so emphatically. Or did they? Opposition parties have cried foul, citing major irregularities in the electoral process. Protests have been ugly ever since. Political analysts have been trying to make sense of the extraordinary events in the region. Some are pointing to the emergence of a new demographic in the electorate who are largely unburdened by their country's historical past.
A person who was born in 1980 is 44 years old now. That person knows nothing about fighting a war in the bush, and they expect a better life. Social media and other things are showing them that there is indeed a better life that is possible. So you are not going to tell them those old stories that you used to tell them. These are people who think very differently, and they've grown up under very different circumstances.
A common feature across these countries is their young electorate. According to the Southern African Development Community, 3/4 of the bloc's population is under 35 years of age. Many of them have struggled to get jobs, and many believe the old ruling parties founded on liberation ideals are not up to the task.
If you look at the economic data in terms of GDP growth, employment creation, household wealth creation, those statistics are dismal across the region.
In Namibia, the ruling Southwest Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, which has been in power since independence, has won the recent polls. However, the opposition has rejected the results in what has been the most competitive election in the country's history. With the winds of political change sweeping through Southern Africa, it remains to be seen how independence-era parties will handle the increased pressure, and also whether opposition parties can deliver on the promises made in their campaigns. Robert Nagila, CGTN.
Well, joining me now to discuss the winds of political change sweeping through Southern Africa are from Pretoria, Professor Christopher Afoke-Isike, President of the African Association of Political Science and Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria. From Aldersdrift, South Africa, Sandile Swana, political analyst and lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand, and in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Novetas Igosha, advocate of the High Court and a political analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Sandile, let me start off with you. Now, previously it was quite fashionable to identify as a former liberation movement. But in recent times, we have seen South Africa's ANC lose its simple majority and form a coalition. Botswana's Democratic Party, in office since 1966, fell from 38 seats to 4. Mozambique's Frelimo has been rejected by the people, and Namibia's SWAPO is facing its toughest challenge yet. The question is, why?
The biggest challenge that we faced is that in the pre-independence period, it was clear that there is a need to remove the colonial power or the apartheid regime, but in order to have a better quality of life, higher standards of living. Now, when you look at how these parties that you've mentioned are losing popularity and losing the voter confidence, it takes time. It has taken 20 years or more in some cases, where votes start declining as the quality of life is not improving. So these parties you've mentioned, dominant parties in Southern Africa, the liberation parties or the independence parties, have not been able to improve the standard of living, quality of life, create full employment, and overall economic growth where people can have tangibility of freedom. So they have a performance gap, and then the people have lost confidence in them for that reason.
Professor Isike, is it your view as well that these parties have failed to improve the quality of life of the people, have failed the liberation movement?
Well, that's one way to look at it. Many of them started very well, was after independence within the first 5 to 10 years. But the major factors that contribute to majority parties declining and losing power eventually, from studies across different countries of the world, show 4 factors. The 4 factors are: 1, factionalism within the party, the dominant party, corruption, and then the opposition coming together to form alliances that eventually take over from the ruling party, and of course the inability of the ruling party to have complete dominance over the electoral management systems. These are the 4 reasons that account for why many dominant parties lose power, and this is scientific all over the world. However, in the case of Southern Africa, as you mentioned, the real reason, all of these factors can be drilled down to one reason, and that reason being the failure of these parties to transit from, liberation parties to political parties. In liberation parties, the ideology of liberation and struggle and the regimentation that comes with it is different from the development needs of post-liberation, which these parties have failed to, transit to political parties in order to meet.
Right. So, Novitas, let me get your view. Do you think liberation parties have stayed true to their founding principles, or have they just simply overstayed?
I cannot say directly that they have overstayed, but I think we're in a very different era of time compared to the liberation movement era, because by the time it was about to take away colonialism of the former European powers, and of course as far as South Africa is concerned, and former German West Africa or Namibia, to challenge the apartheid regime. But what has happened today, we realize that the political liberation movement has not materialized into economic independence or to give the people material wealthy as far as the working class and youth. And given this point of time, there are so many dynamics at play. We have multilateral order, the rise of China and resurgent Russia. At the same time, Africa is undergoing through an era of plurality. And if you can remember the early 1980s towards the 1990s, the Bretton Woods institution had given the so-called structural adjustment programs. Now, to adjust to these reforms, it was not very easy. So to say that they have not met their core objective of liberation is a question of ideological perspective. But today, economic situation, you find those in power have come up with nepotism, cronyism, and to some extent, state capture, as far as some economies like the Guptas in South Africa, to give an example.
Right. So, Professor Isike, your view is that the liberation era parties have perhaps struggled to adapt their revolutionary ideologies to democratic governments. So why have some liberation movements in the Southern African region, such as ANC, ZANU-PF, SWAPO in Namibia, they have all faced similar challenges, though? Are there shared structural issues and common challenges that have run across the region?
Well, the one common denominator in all of those, and this is not just in Southern Africa, it's the entire continent, is the failure to also grapple with the inherited colonial states. So the idea of the state in Africa was never established, was never made to be developmental in its purpose. These are contraptions that were created by the colonialists to be exploitative, and for it to be exploitative, it needed to be corrupt. So when at independence, many states in the continent took over these colonial states, the one thing we failed to do in Africa was to interrogate the purpose of the states in the first place. So if the states were created by the colonialists to facilitate exploitation and corruption, so exploitation of our resources from Africa to Europe, when we took them over, did we bother to interrogate them and repurpose them to meet the developmental aspirations of our people? I think we failed to do those. We simply adopted them and continue to run the states with the way we saw the colonialists run the state. And this can explain why, for instance, our leaders loot money from Africa and take it to Europe to invest, rather than investing it in the continent, even assuming stealing the money in the first place was not bad enough.
Right. So let me come back to you, Sandile, now, because we've talked about the challenges that liberation era parties are facing in the transition from revolutionary to democratic political parties. Liberation era parties are often promised economic emancipation, but inequality remains a persistent issue. And I take the example of South Africa, for instance. So what went wrong in translating political freedom into economic freedom?
Indeed, both systems of colonialism and apartheid, both systems are systems of inequality. The tragedy is that we have had, for instance, both in these areas, Namibia and South Africa, the profile is basically the same. We have now had a situation where inequality is at its measured inequalities at its highest level. The World Bank has rated South Africa #1 in the world in terms of inequality. Now, the reason why this inequality has continued is that there needed to be an understanding and a correction of that that goes with it, which is that it is how institutions are designed and operated that actually reproduces inequality. So if your transformational process, let's say, is driven just by projects rather than by the transformation of institutions, which is a long-term effect, then the existing institutions continue to reproduce the apartheid and the colonialism that they produce. And in fact, it's amplifying over time, as we can see in South Africa. So that is the problem, that how are we going to deliver this freedom? That question was not properly understood. And at some point, it was actually sabotaged by the factions that are within the liberation movement.
Right. So, Novetas, tell us a little bit about this, because Sandile is asking, how can we manage the transition better? In your view, though, have liberation parties, and if we take the example of Tanzania, though, balance their historical legacy with the demands of today's governance?
Okay, there are so many significant points here to play. Number one, I think governments need to be accountable to the citizenry as far as giving policies that are giving opportunities to all the people, because what is happening today in many parts of Africa is for the population or the young generation having no intentional education. Consider other places where there was also colonialism, like Vietnam, which was once colonized by the Japanese, then later the French, then in 29 years of fighting with the Americans. As far as their education system is concerned, and their mode of government is also accountable to the people. Another significant example is the People's Republic of China over the past 50 to 55 years. Though their ideology is still socialism, they have embraced a meritocracy where the people can be able to get the opportunities and enjoy the national cake. Now, in our case, you can find certain economies like the Republic of South Africa, the national cake is in a few hands of the people. What we need to do, number one, we need to come up with strong institutions. that they can be able to transform the nature of ideology, the nature of our education system today. But as far as going up to enjoy the national cake, we need to have a meritocracy where even young people, even people on the ground can have a chance into the economy.
Sandile, what is your take? Do these parties still have a future as dominant forces in African politics, or is their influence now just destined to end?
They do have a place, but I will put it differently, that these things that we're mentioning here, improvements of the education system, improvement of skills and techniques for negotiating contracts, etc., any party can do that. A new party, an old party can do that, because it just takes a human being to do that. So what it means is that the ANC in our case here in South Africa, and ZANU-PF and Frelimo, MPLA and so on, need to now have new thinking altogether to understand that this period we're in is not even the celebratory period, the post-independence celebratory period that we have experienced, short, which was 10, 15 years, depending which country you are entering. New, total managerial, competent operations need to be there. It doesn't help to be talking history of what you did in the jungle during the Bush War and what have you. You need to prove that you can actually create relevant technologies and compete with China, compete with the US in every relevant field, and so on, and even collaborate effectively with those countries. So they can have that, but for now, they are going to take a hammering, and they are not going to be as big as they used to be. The idea of one dominant party in Southern Africa, in our region, is falling by the wayside. It's coalitions now.
All right, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll continue with our discussions on the new wave of change sweeping across Southern Africa. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor Christopher Isike, Novetas Igosha, and Sandile Swana. Before the break, we looked at why liberation-era parties are struggling in Southern Africa. Let's now look at what the future may hold for political parties in the region. Now, Sandile, the Southern African Development Corporation was formed in 1992 to promote economic development in Southern African region. But still, as we've alluded, there are huge societal challenges and there's growing social polarization. Instead of the touted prosperity for all, is the new wave of political parties likely to bring the much needed change here?
The much needed change can come into play as soon as the new parties, and I mean, I suppose we are assuming now that new parties are also coming into play, or the old parties such as Frelimo are in sufficient pressure to start doing the right thing. If we assume that, then there are a few things that are within sight that need to be attended to. One of them is the creation of a SADC innovation system. So what I mean by that is that the research institutions, including the universities, need to be in one system, or a collaborative system that produces technologies that become products that are then sold within SADC across the countries, and also outside of SADC on the continent and beyond. That system also means that you should be able, if you are in South Africa, for instance, to take courses in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and so on. So that's one. Two is the network industries, such as the railway systems. We have not developed the railway systems that needed to be developed to integrate SADC as a whole for economic purposes, not colonial purposes,
right,
for economic purposes of the indigenous purpose. And lastly, the telecoms industry, so that it is fully integrated and readily available to everybody. So those are the things that will have to come with the new thinking of the new parties in this new period that we're entering.
Professor Isike, I want to look at the role of the young people here, because there's a change of demographic across the continent. Africa is the youngest continent is the continent with the largest population of young people. Young people today have no memory and little knowledge of the 1960 era. Do liberation parties still have a compelling ideological narrative that resonates with today's public?
No, they don't. They don't. So the sentiments that came with, the liberation struggle is wearing away very quickly, especially because of the failure of the state to deliver. So if the state had delivered, if they had repurposed the state and then delivered on services, healthcare services, education services, and the state delivered on employment, and people could feel the relevance of the state in their lives, and people became patriotic to the state, the young people will come and become more loyal to the state than even their fathers, because there will be no need to now question the purpose of the state, or why they should be loyal to the state, or why they should believe in the state. The problem is that when the state fails to deliver, and older people continue to vote for them, the young people at a point will begin to ask questions around, why do we need to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? So this is the reason why many of them are asking questions across the region. And not, like I said, it's not just Southern Africa. You also see this in East Africa, in Kenya. We saw it. We saw a bit of it in Nigeria in the elections in 2023. There is a resurgence of young people becoming more politically active and asking questions of why they should remain indolent and continue to do things the same way without seeing results in terms of service delivery. So the state needs to be more meaningful, and if it is not, then liberation struggle and all the sentiments that go with that is meaningless to them, like you said, because they have not lived that.
Right, there's clearly a lot that needs to happen if the liberation era parties are to remain sustainable. What will be the most significant challenge that will face liberation parties in Southern Africa into the next decade, Novatus?
The greatest challenge will be the changing of the global economy and how it puts pressure to these Southern African countries. For example, today we are in the digital century with the rise of artificial intelligence and new hyper technologies. Now, as far as these technologies are coming into the market, if the people do not have the skills to embrace these changes, at the end of the day, they will look to their governments or their parties for accountability. The only way to think forward is to tap into the global economy. You find Southern African countries do not have specific policies to negotiate with major economies like China or the USA, but these countries, despite they are huge and quite influential in the global economy, have specific forums to negotiate with African countries. Now, in order to manage to continue to survive, to have consistency, it is very important to change the perspective and the ideology in our time, especially as far as economic policies and economic diplomacy is concerned.
Right, Sandile,
but accountability is also very crucial.
Sandile, what's your take? What do you see as the most significant challenge for the liberation parties into the next decade?
The parties, the liberation parties and independence parties have to embrace technocratism of some sort. In other words, I think other authors here, speakers here have said it's meritocracy. But there is a lot of technical detail as I listen to the surrounding parties talking and engaging with issues, and as we measure progress, the technocratic ability of the state is lacking, and the technocratic ability to run themselves as parties is also lacking. So you find a lot of hindrances are within the party itself. They are using Bush mentality inside the party. So that professionalism, if we're to use common language, professionalism needs to kick in.
So I want to get your final comments. Novitas, starting off with you, what lessons can Southern African liberation era parties learn from the transition of other liberation movements in other parts of Africa like Ghana, Kenya or Tanzania?
The first thing they have to learn is that you cannot stop the forces of change. You must embrace them, then evolve with them. Now, that has to do with accountability. That has to do with constitutionalism or democratic ideals as far as the Kenyan political framework is concerned. And at the end of the day, people need to see a way of how their leaders come to the ground and embrace these changes. Like in my previous comment, I said that in Tanzania right now, we have a so-called 4R philosophical doctrine, whereby the president has advocated for reforms, resilience, and resilience has to do with embracing these changes into our time by advocating economic diplomacy and welcoming investors from abroad, but at the same time taking what we can build up together collaboratively.
So in your view, Professor Isike, what lessons can Southern African liberation era parties learn from the transition of liberation movements in other parts of Africa, sort of like Ghana or Kenya or Tanzania?
Well, like our friend from Tanzania said, there are international reconfigurations that are taking place. There are new opportunities that are emerging. We are talking about, for example, Africa having a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council and possibly with veto power if things go our way. What does it mean for Africa? Which state in Africa can sit among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and justify its position there, not just in terms of what it has to offer, but what it does at home? So for me, many of these states should do the first thing, which they were failed to do at independence, which is to convene some kind of a political conference of all representatives, all interests, and to ask the question of whether we want to continue to live, to run the state the way we've run them, whether the state should be more meaningful in people's life, and then to begin to ask questions around what type of democracy. And there are examples in the Nordic countries of the world, in Canada, close to the United States, examples of social democracies that are not socialist, they are not communist, but they are social democracies. These are states that deliver public health to its citizens free of charge, states that deliver on public quality education to its citizens free of charge. So once we repurpose the state and begin to rethink and adopt social democracy, democratic policies, right, you will find that the state will become more meaningful. There will be more trust in the political systems.
Sandile, you have the final word.
The independence parties as well as the liberation parties need to, and all of us around them, need to accept that right now when you get a country, it has resources, it has infrastructure and everything. But that is only the seed. That is not a harvest that you must consume. A lot of our leaders have spent a lot of time now focusing on consuming what is there. Meantime, we are already aware that even our GDPs could have grown by 4 times, 6 times, 10 times, rather than consuming what was there. The philosophy must be a philosophy of expansion and a philosophy of abundance for the common people.
Indeed, a very interesting discussion there, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Sandile Swana, political analyst and lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand, Novitas Igosha, advocate of the High Court and political analyst, and Professor Christopher Afoke Isike, president of the African Association of Political Science and professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.